this computer, and great, it started recording. So, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Gabor Deveni, and most of you actually know me from different parts of life. So not just the future talks, but I met a lot of you in other different meetups, but this is not my usual professional one. This is about emerging technologies and their impact on life. And today we have a great speaker, Alex Kingsbury, who I actually just very quickly introduced. So Alex, I actually met Alex through a friend of mine, a colleague of mine, who, when I mentioned to her that Vicky and I are planning to run a conference about emerging technologies, she told me that, oh, why don't you contact Alex? She's my kind of my neighbor, and she's pretty good in the 3D printing stuff. And I'm like, oh, really? I'm like, okay, let's do that. So I first Googled Alex's name, and I just found some pretty good stuff. And I'm like, oh, wow, she's really famous. She's presenting overseas regularly. She's known quite well. She's managing director, I think, at the additive manufacturing, sorry, I probably mispronounced the company name, but it's about additive manufacturing. And then I saw her speaking at a conference as well, not just on YouTube video, and that was awesome. So Vicky and I invited Alex to speak at our conference, which should have been in April. Unfortunately, it had to be postponed, of course, because of COVID-19, and now it will be next April. But Alex would have been overseas, so we couldn't secure Alex. But while we couldn't have her in the conference, in the meetup today, we can. Alex, do you want to introduce yourself? And I know you're doing a lot of stuff. You are also in the Women in 3D Printing organization. So yeah, I just let you introduce yourself.
Yeah, thank you, Gabor, and thanks so much for inviting me to talk today. I'm really looking forward to it. I think it's been a little bit actually of a tough day for a lot of people. We've had the presidential debate earlier today, which was a bit of a train wreck. And anyway, so look, I hope to give you a couple of, hopeful stories and interesting things to take your mind off everything that's happened today. A little bit about me. So I've been working, I'm an engineer by background, and I've been working in 3D printing for nearly 10 years now. And it started when I joined CSIRO. So that was around the time that metal 3D printing was starting to take off internationally. A lot of big companies were starting to take notice and invest in the technology. And that's when we decided we were already in metals, like metal processing, metal powders, metal powder consolidation technologies. And I was already working in that space. And so we decided to pull the trigger and buy a 3D printer. And that was really my first foray into 3D printing. And I've been working in it ever since. And yeah, as far as some other things that I've done, I guess, so I was at CSIRO. I have ran a consultancy for a couple of years called Additive Economics. And now I'm really full-time at RMIT University. So I just recently decided, in the middle of a pandemic, no less, to start my PhD finally. It's been probably a long time coming. And so I'm doing that, but I'm also leading engagement for the RMIT Centre for Additive Manufacturing. I am an industry fellow at RMIT, and yeah, and one of the volunteer things I do in my time outside of work is I'm the chair of Oceania for Women in 3D Printing. So Women in 3D Printing it's a global organisation, and we have 2 chapters across Oceania. I'm hoping to grow that a little bit more. Billy, who's on the line, is one of our ambassadors, and we run a lot of great events and have a lot of fantastic social times. But yeah, so I work across, in additive manufacturing, a lot of different industries. I'm probably more, to be honest, aerospace more focused. Certainly that's my PhD. But the medical industry is one that I've had a lot to do with over the years as well. And it's a topic that is just, so inordinately interesting. I think it's something that, it affects all of us, our everyday lives, people that we know, people that we love. And it's so fantastic to look at the way in which technology can help us, create better outcomes for us. And today what I'd like to do is tell you about how additive manufacturing can change the nature of implant manufacturing. So yes, thanks Gabor. That's a little bit about me. Did you want me to share my screen?
Yeah, why not? Let's start. I think we have now a few more people joined, so I think we are ready to start with it.
Oh, you've disabled attendee screen sharing.
I did that. Okay, so let me don't want to share it. I want to allow advanced sharing option. Great. In theory, you can share now. Thank you.
Yes, that's no problems. Looks good. Okay. And so before I start, I want to also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm on and each of you are on, assuming you're all calling in from Australia, and pay my respects to elders past, present and future. It's tadpole season here in the Kulin Nation, and so we've got a lot of birds chirping and a lot of flowers blooming, and it's a beautiful time of year. And I'm very happy to join you from part of the Kulin Nation. Like I explained, I want to talk to you about how personalized implants have evolved. Well, I want to talk to you about how personalized implants have evolved over time. But to do that, what I might do is just start with a little bit of background on what additive manufacturing actually is, just for those of you who may not be so familiar with it. And this is a very brief intro. Additive manufacturing is actually it's a collection of a number of different technologies. So there is a number of different ways in which you can do 3D printing. And by the way, when I say additive manufacturing, I use that interchangeably with 3D printing. They're the same thing. Additive manufacturing is just more probably the technical term. 3D printing is more the mass use term. But anyway, they're interchangeable and I use them interchangeably. So it is a collection of technologies. There are 7 official recognized types of additive manufacturing. But this is the main one I really want to talk to you about today. And I would say, apart from your sort of typical sort of polymer extrusion type processes, the ones that you can find in Officeworks and Bunnings and Aldi, this is probably the most common type for using metals. So we use a laser and we basically aim that down at what's called a powder bed. So that's a bed or a layer of metal powder. We use a 3D file. So additive manufacturing always starts with a 3D model. That model is sliced into layers, and then that layer information is sent to the 3D printer. And like I said, it uses a laser then to lay down or fuse together the metal powder into those layers to create a solid object. So you can kind of see here we have our product that's being fused in layers, and then surrounding that we have unfused metal powder. So it's a layer by layer process, and pretty much anything that's layer by layer can be called additive manufacturing, although not officially. And it's called additive manufacturing because it's additive in nature, it's not subtractive. And what I mean by not subtractive or subtractive technologies, that's where you take a chunk of metal and you machine it. So you mill out what you don't want. You create a lot of waste. Whereas with additive manufacturing, you're really just fusing the metal powder that you want for the product, the final product that you want to make. So it's very low waste technology, which is why it's got some green credentials attached to it. Any of that unfused powder, by the way, gets recycled and can be reused. Okay, so the case for personalized implants, I guess what have we got at the moment and what could we do instead? Now, if you have, many people are familiar with hip implants, and that's where, if you have, there's a problem with the head of your femur and your socket joint, so where you're fitting into your pelvis there. And let's say you need a hip replacement. So what the surgeon will do is they'll look at your anatomy and then they go to the shelf and then they choose from a number of set sizes, which size is probably going to be your best approximation at a fit. And then what they do is in surgery, take that implant, they take away whatever bone is required in order to fit that implant to you, and then sew you up. Now, the issue with that is that they're removing most likely unhealthy bone, but also healthy bone in order to fit that implant correctly. Unhealthy bone typically won't grow in and accept an implant, so you have to cut into the healthy bone in order for that implant to be successful. Really what you want, and bone is an amazing thing. It's, you know, it's a living organism, and it will grow, so it regenerates. Your body has actually the facility and the ability to do that. So it will regenerate and it will grow into the implant, which is what you want it to do. That's a successful implant that helps keep it strong and secure and attached. The worst thing that can happen is that it becomes unattached, and then you need to go in for a revision surgery. So if we are going down a 3D printing route, like I said, it's a layer by layer process. And so all you need is that 3D model to create that 3D shape. Unlike mass manufacturing, where it really relies on that standardized manufacturing, with 3D printing, you can really create whatever shape it is that you want, and then 3D print it. So you've got a lot of flexibility in your design because you're not constrained by traditional manufacturing methods to certain tool paths and so on. And you also have the ability to incorporate much more complex structures. So if you see, for example, this lattice structure here on the right, it's a spinal implant. That's very complex, and you could not produce that with traditional manufacturing methods. Same goes with the one on the left, for example. Very, very complex latticing structures. You can't produce those with conventional methods. And furthermore, you can also personalize. So, you know, it is no big deal for a 3D printer to create a personalized product than it is to create a standard product. The cost is exactly the same. The inputs are exactly the same. But it has the ability to just so easily personalize. It also relies on, you know, digital information, and so much of the surgical planning process is very digital. So it feeds very nicely into that workflow. Okay, so I want to take you through a couple of case studies that I've been involved in and have also happened around in Australia. Before I start though, I just want to say Australia is really leading the way when it comes to personalized implants. We have been, you know, really in such a strong position to be doing these types of projects. It's due to a couple of reasons. We have a really progressive clinician base here in Australia. We have a very strong healthcare system, and we also have some really great design capability in Australia. And we also have the manufacturing capability as well. And these are all things that I think we should be really proud of. So, you know, manufacturing hasn't had the best reputation of late. And, you know, there's a lot of negative talk around what manufacturing is or isn't to Australia. But in my experience, Australia actually is in a very, very strong position for certain types of manufacturing, and medical technologies is definitely one of them. 3D printing is definitely one of them. So anyway, moving on, I'll get off my soapbox and I'll tell you about Len, who had a heel replacement. So that guy down in the corner is Len. He had cancer of the heel bone. And unfortunately, to remove a cancer that is in your heel bone, so that's the it's called the calcaneus bone, and it sits right down there at the base of your foot. The treatment for a calcaneus cancer is to remove the calcaneus. Now, unfortunately, if you remove your calcaneus, you need to amputate below the knee. There's no implant available, and there's no other solution other than an amputation. So amputation, obviously, you know, severe lack of mobility for a patient, but also in a more broader context leads to a whole lot of you know, deleterious health outcomes because they're immobilized. They're now in a wheelchair. This project came about because Len was seeing a man called Professor Chung at St. Vincent's Hospital, and Professor Chung had said, if we could do something quite revolutionary, which is 3D print an implant, is that something you would be keen on? Would you be game for that? And Len, in his later years and being wheelchair bound would not be a great outcome for him, said, you know, sure, sign me up, let's do it. So St. Vincent's then worked with Anatomics. Anatomics is a design, medtech design company that's here in Melbourne. And Anatomics then contacted CSIRO, where I was at the time. And Anatomics basically did all the design and CSIRO did the manufacturing.
Different regions. So incredible amount of diversity. And we operate within that.
Perhaps someone needs to mute. Or Gabor, you can sort that out for me. Thank you. So not only was the calcaneus implant able to be produced, but it was also able to be fully customized or personalized to Len's anatomy. The designers at Anatomics were able to take the healthy calcaneus bone and mirror it and produce the design from there. You can see here it's got a couple of different features that I'd like to point out. So this here up at the top left was our first prototype. But what we found actually is that mesh was too fine to really be usable. We weren't really convinced that we'd be able to remove all of the powder from the mesh. And, you know, being something that's in the human body, we really want to be sure that you're not letting any powder flow around. So we needed to create a mesh that was going to be much safer. And that's this one here, which was the final product. We also have things like fixation points for sutures. We were able to do really clever things like, for example, the suture point was exactly the angle of the suture needle. That's very, very hard to do with traditional manufacturing. We were able to create these surfaces here that were exactly aligned to the adjoining bone, that the adjoining bone could articulate against nice and easily. The reason that we have this lattice structure here is really primarily to reduce weight, because titanium is actually, it's a lightweight material, but it is heavier than bone. So we don't want to have heavy implants. We want to have them as light as we can. So we're able to remove material by incorporating a lattice structure. The other thing too I should point out is that this is produced in titanium. So titanium is a metal that we use quite commonly for biomedical applications. We also use it in aerospace, occasionally a bit in marine. It's a well-known alloy and it's easily processable in additive manufacturing machines. It's actually quite difficult to process conventionally. It's a tricky material to weld. It's a tricky material to cut as well. So that's another one of the, I guess, just hidden advantages of using 3D printing. The implant design you can see up in the top right was performed by RMIT. So RMIT saw what had happened and said, you know what, we've seen this lattice structure and we think we could do an even more clever lattice structure. So they designed that one, and that was really the seeding point for a lot of the work that they were able to do further down the track that I'll talk about a couple of slides from now. The end result of this story is that the surgeon was able to take Len, remove his calcaneus bone with the cancer, was able to take the implant and slot it in. And the comments from Professor Chung were that it was like slotting in a jigsaw piece puzzle. It was so easy and so smooth. Len's made a fantastic recovery and was back on his feet, able to keep his leg, which is lovely for all concerned. So very much a success story. The next one that we were involved in, this is with CSIRO and Anatomics as well. Having done the story with the heel, that word really spread around the globe. Like I said, it was, well, I don't think I mentioned it, but it was a world first achievement for that type of implant. And there was a surgeon in Spain who had a patient with a tumour on the sternum, so sternum and ribs. And one of the issues with tumours is that they do tend to eat away at healthy bone. So not only do they sit on bone, but they also degrade the bone, and it really compromises the structural integrity of the bone. This type of tumour is unfortunately reasonably common, and the way that you would normally treat it is with a plate and screw type implant. It's relatively cheap, but it's not very effective because the screws aren't often secured very well into the ribs. Ribs are, obviously quite small, and there's not a lot of bone stock there to really work with. So it can be difficult and very challenging to get good fixation of the implant onto the bone. The reason we worry so much about this is because if you have an implant that's coming loose, you're going to need to go in for a revision surgery. Now, no one wants to do revision surgery. You really need to avoid it at all costs. Not only highly unpleasant for the patient who has to put up with a, faulty implant basically for way too long, also actually a huge cost to the healthcare system as well. And also degrades the bone. So when you get movement around an implant with bone, you reduce the level of fixation that you get, so that the amount of bone ingrowth that you get, and also degrade the bone. So anyway, enough about that. We were able to produce this solution, which was a customized, personalized solution, using 3D printing again, using titanium. And that was a sternum and rib implant that you can see there. One of the cool things I want to point out here is in the top right, we had a guide here. So Anatomics again did all of the design for this. Absolutely, credit to them for the amazing work that they've done. And they also will produce cutting guides for every single implant. The heel implant actually had a cutting guide as well. So a cutting guide works where, if you can see that top white structure, that was 3D printed. And when it comes in the box into surgery, surgeon opens it up, cuts open the patient, removes the tumour, and then is able to take that cutting guide, notch it onto the top of the clavicle, and then make his cuts down. That's right. Then removes the tumour, and then takes the implant and then fits the implant in. And once again, the feedback from the surgeon was, it was like a jigsaw piece puzzle. It was just so easy to be able to fit it in. One of the really cool things about this was this design here that you can see at the ends, the fixation points for the ribs. So that was what Anatomics coined as a tulip type design, which meant that rather than the implant sitting on top of the rib and just having one screw through with no fixation at the end, this was able to go over the end of the rib and have a screw from top to bottom. So it was very, very securely in place. Anatomics has really moved on quite a lot. They've done a couple of these sternum and rib type projects, and you see one down the bottom right down there as well. So you can see that the design's actually progressed quite a bit, and the white material that you see on top of that implant there is a material. It's a sort of a spongy material, and it's called Porstar, and it's it's a material that was developed with CSIRO and Anatomics in a collaboration, and it's mainly used for things like facial implants. But here it was able to provide just a little layer of protection in the chest. The chest is an area where bone sits quite close to the skin. And if you've got a titanium metal implant sitting there right up close to the skin, it can be a little bit uncomfortable. So yeah, like I said, it's progressed quite a lot. The next one I want to talk about is a spinal implant. So this was done again with Anatomics, the stars of the show here at the moment, and RMIT University and the Prince of Wales Hospital. So Amanda was born with a spinal deformity, and as she has grown up, that deformity has caused her significant and chronic pain. And she had had a number of different treatments, none of which were successful or really assisted her with the chronic pain that she was experiencing. And she was, absolutely at her wit's end. And so was seeing a specialist at the Prince of Wales Hospital who said, the only solution here for your situation, just because it is so unique and it's not an off-the-shelf type situation, is to do a 3D printed implant. And so then, yeah, Anatomics and RMIT work together. Again, what I wanted to point out is this lattice structure here that you can see. So the implant is not a solid block of titanium that can be easily milled, you know, via subtractive machining. This is additively produced, and the weight reduction that you're able to achieve with that is really, really quite significant. And importantly, for a situation where you have a spine and you're sitting in between two different bones. So if you can see there, and this is 3D printed as well, this white structure here, you can see that this implant is sitting in between two different bones here. Now there's a property called the Young's modulus, which really relates to the stiffness of a material. And if a material, for example, if titanium is too stiff, or actually just back up a sec, the Young's modulus of titanium does not equal the Young's modulus of bone. So it's much higher, it's a much stiffer material than bone. We know bone to be actually a little bit porous and a little bit flexible, not so much for titanium. So what we want to be able to do is match the stiffness of bone to the stiffness of titanium. And what we're able to do is use that lattice structure. So we manipulate the design of the implant to change the Young's modulus, the stiffness of the material. And that way, the implant can sit quite happily against the adjoining bone and not degrade it. Because if it's too stiff, it will degrade the surrounding bone. And remember, that's healthy bone. That's bone we want to keep. So the lattice structure is able to do that. And that's really where, you know, I call this talk the evolution of personalized implants, because what you're able to see now is a bit of a progression of thinking, design thinking, of technology thinking, about the ways in which we do personalized implants. And, you know, I'm not going to labor the point too much more, but once again, all in Australia. So really, we're leading the way. The next one I'll talk about is, this is really funny. This guy said, give me a Brad Pitt jaw. So I had to call this the Brad Pitt jaw. But this man was, again, had a deformity of the jaw. Now, the jaw is a really interesting and very challenging part of the body to work with. Very specialist surgeons that work with this called maxillofacial surgeons. And part of the reason is that there is so much going on in the face. So, and particularly for the jaw, for example, you consider the loads that are applied to your jaw as applied to, say, your knee. Your knee has bending, it might have a bit of impact, and that's really about it. It's quite simple, the forces that a knee experiences. However, with a jaw, you have talking, you have chewing, you have grinding, you have clenching. So there's loads of different things and different forces being applied to your jaw. And not to mention, you have movement this way, up and down. So there's a lot going on, and it's a very, it's a very difficult part of the body to be able to accommodate. And not to mention, it's part of our face. So when using something like a standardized product, it's really not suitable because it's, you know, not only is it just not going to work from a mechanical point of view, because our faces are kind of almost like our thumbprints. It's why we use facial recognition, because they are so unique to us. It's not like, you know, a hip. So it's very unique to us. And if you get it wrong, and if you're using a standardized implant for that, you are not going to look right. And it's important to be able to look right, but probably more importantly, it's important to be able to use your jaw, because that's how you speak and that's how you eat. And there's a whole lot of data around not being able to chew properly, which then has a whole lot of flow-on effects for diet, and then for lifestyle, and then for health outcomes. So anyway, moving on to Richard, I believe that I recall that was his name. He had a deformity of the jaw and was able to work again with St. Vincent's Hospital, a specialist surgeon, not Peter Chung anymore, and had this implant created for him that was 3D printed. You can see up in the top right. The surgeon, George Dimitroulis, then decided, you know what, this is actually something that I'm going to spin out as a business. So he created a business called OMX Solutions. And OMX Solutions specialize in 3D printed maxillofacial implants now, and you can see that there's one down here in the bottom right as well. So they do a whole lot of very complex and very sort of, I guess there's a real human need behind these types of implants. These are people's faces and their confidence, and the way that it affects a lot about not only just their health, but the way that they feel that they can live their lives. And next one I want to talk about is the final one. So I'm actually going to wrap up pretty soon. So prepare all your questions and we can have a chat about it. This is really what I see as being all of these cases that I've described to you already has culminated in this project that we have at the moment that's going and is ongoing at the moment, so not finished. It's a very big, long project called Just-in-Time Personalised Implants. It's partly funded by IMCRC, so that's the Innovative Manufacturing CRC, and also by Stryker. So Stryker is a major global supplier of not just implants, but a whole lot of medical technologies. So Stryker is one that they produce off-the-shelf standardized implants. And also, interestingly, they also produce 3D printed implants that are standard. So they've been able to use 3D printing for standard size implants, and they really just do that because of, as I was describing before, you're able to incorporate a lot more complexity into an implant's structure, which really enhances its performance. So what they do is they 3D print not the underlying base of a acetabular cup, so the hip implant, but the covering. So they 3D print that and then they attach it onto a hip implant. So they already do that and are very familiar with 3D printing and 3D printing technologies and being able to run a big 3D printing factory. So they're quite comfortable with the technology and they're already using it on a commercial basis, but only for standard sized implants. So anyway, they're very interested in this area of personalized implants. I will say that they are, again, pumping up Australia's tyres, global medtech company choosing to do their research in Australia. And that's really because of our track record with personalised implants. So we're working with RMIT, is working with St. Vincent's Hospital, probably no surprise given that they've already been featured in a couple of these case studies, and the University of Technology, Sydney. And really what we want to do here is take personalised implants to the next level. And this is one of the key things about this project. So every other case study I've just highlighted, apart from perhaps the rib case study and also to an extent the TMJ, the jaw, has been one-off. And it's actually, it's great to be able to do those one-offs. And it's even better when they're successful, which they all have been. But what you need to show is something that looks like more of a commercial plan around how we roll these out, not just for one patient in one sort of scenario, but for multiple patients. So what this is able to do, this project is looking to do, and is to be able to do everything from automating the scanning, the implant design, and then the tooling. So using robotics in surgery to be able to do the cuts. And then you have your 3D print and then you have your surgery. They've really focused in on this type of tumour you see up the top left here, which is tumour of the femur. It's quite common. It's quite a common area for tumour growth. They're focusing in on that area because that, as far as implants go, is one of the highest need areas for this type of implant. So they see that there is an addressable market in that. However, having said that, the learnings from this project absolutely will be applied to other parts of the body as well. It's just we're not quite there in terms of the maturity yet. We need to be able to prove out the model, and we're still in the process of doing that. And so what you can see down in the bottom bottom right, is these implants here that have been designed, but designed with straight cuts. And that again, if we recall how I was talking about, we don't want to remove healthy bone. And if you're doing these types of straight cuts, then you are going to be removing health. You'll be removing part of the tumor, all of the tumor, yes. But really what you want to do is minimize the amount of healthy bone that you're cutting out. So to do that, you need to do what we call conformal cutting. So cutting right around the margins of the tumor in a very sort of organically shaped way. Now, you can produce an implant for that shape because you're using additive manufacturing. So you couldn't use traditional manufacturing techniques to be able to produce that it'd be very difficult to produce that sort of organic shape or outline. And you certainly couldn't use traditional manufacturing techniques to be able to produce the ladder structures that we're designing. So recalling back at the heel, when RMIT said we think we can use lattice structure as the infill for this implant to reduce the stiffness, to reduce the weight, and also, by the way, you know, allow bodily fluid to travel in and out, help things like the ingrowth of the bone into the implant, which you can do much more effectively with additive manufacturing and the complex structures that you have. But you can also create these really conformal and organic style of shapes. So the bottom left is a really good example of that. And you may think, oh, it's easy to create these sorts of organic lines in your cutting. It's not. It's very difficult. And the tooling that we have for surgery, so these are literally your saws that you use to cut bones out, they're all designed for straight cuts. So what we've had to do is design a whole new set of tooling and then a whole new set of robotic code as well. And at the end of this project, what we want to get to a point where we're able to have that whole entire workflow completely automated. So that is the conclusion of my presentation. I'm really looking forward to your questions and, you know, and also any comments you have as well. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Alex. That's fantastic. Sorry, I will probably put it into gallery view. That was very insightful. Like this is so great to see the, you know, the science behind it. Is to me, it's a lot of it seems like science fiction, but it's already there, and the quality that it changed people's life into, yeah, that's amazing. We're moving into Q&A. So we have one question. This is not my question, but someone asked me to ask it. So the question is, what stage these 3D printing surgery items are? Are they in clinical trial or something else?
So again, I think in terms of what stage is 3D printing at when it comes to creating implants, because we also have 3D printing happening for a whole lot of other types of you know, devices in medicine. But as far as implants is concerned, if you recall, we had the standard size implants and we have personalized implants. So standard implants are being 3D printed today, and they are already out there in people's bodies walking around. So I mentioned that Stryker, for example, was doing 3D printing for part of their Acetabular cup, and I believe a couple of other. They've got a spinal implant as well that's 3D printed, that's been approved. Probably the best known case though is an Acetabular cup that's been, and I hope everyone knows what I'm talking about when I say Acetabular cup, but it's the hip implant, and I think I've actually got a sample of it if I can just go duck over there, but it's completely 3D printed, and that has been it's a company now owned by GE, but that's been going for over 10 years now. So importantly, what that means is that there is 10 years worth of data of people who are walking around with a 3D printed implant in them, and that's very valuable. But it is a standard size implant. It's not a personalized implant. So you could definitely say, as far as maturity goes, standard size implants are much more standard size implants that are 3D printed. It's a much more mature progression than what personalized is. And a lot of what is, maybe, you know, you could say, well, okay, how come every single standard implant is not 3D printed? And that's really comes down to cost. So you can certainly enhance performance of a standardized implant with 3D printing, but it is a more expensive option. So yeah, there's a market for it, but I wouldn't say it's ubiquitous.
Thank you, Alex. I had a couple of more questions in the chat flowing in. So Clinton asking actually two questions. One of them is how heavy are the implants? And the other one is how do you follow up on scans like X-ray? X-ray might be out of question.
Yeah.
So heavy implants and following up on scans.
So the implant, we really try and, weight wise, the stiffness is more important than the weight. And that's when I was talking about the Young's modulus. The worst thing you can have is have an implant that crushes the surrounding bone. You really want it to be bone friendly and just sitting up really nice and gently against the bone and not being too stiff against the bone. Make your implant not stiff enough, then it might fail. So there is a bit of a sweet spot there, but generally, matching the stiffness of bone is just perfect. But moving on, the weight though, so generally when you are doing your optimization for stiffness, you're also hugely reducing the weight. So some of those structures that I showed you, the lattice structures, they're really optimized around the stiffness. But the weight reduction is quite large. We're talking sort of 80% of a weight reduction that you would get from titanium. And if we think about the heel implant, now that had a pretty basic structure to it. By the way, I should mention that heel was turned around within 3 weeks. So from design, from receiving the call, or actually, I should say 2 weeks as far as CSIRO was concerned, from receiving the call to being able to produce an implant and have it fully finished and sterilized and in surgery. That was I think actually 10-day turnaround. So very, very quick turnarounds that you're able to get for something that's personalized, but I'm getting off track. How do you follow up on the scans? That's a really good point. And it is something that is challenging with titanium. So titanium has a sort of a reflection index, basically. When you're looking at bone on an X-ray, your titanium implants will be out there looking like bright lights in your body because they're reflecting back the light. And one of the difficulties around that is that it makes it quite hard. So if it's a cancer situation, you've had cancer, then if you were to get secondaries, you are more than likely going to get them around the location of the implant. And that's sort of an unfortunate reality that we deal with cancer and with implants. So what I would say about that is that when you're using traditional implants, they're very solid, they're very heavy. They're also made of titanium, same material. And if you're moving to 3D printing, particularly when you're doing all the right things around optimizing for the stiffness so that you have a successful implant, you're not only reducing stiffness, you're reducing the weight, but you're also reducing the amount of material in your body, foreign material. So what that means is that you get less reflection off your X-ray. The point I was trying to make just before was when you get that reflection, it actually sometimes interferes with, I'm not a specialist in this area, but it interferes with your ability to see other tumors growing. So if you're getting secondaries in that region, someone might miss it just because of the reflection that you're getting off the titanium. I hope that answered your question, Clinton.
Thank you, Alex. We have a few more. So actually 3 more I can see as at least. The next one is from Craig. Do the 3D printed hip implants last longer than a normal one?
So the jury's still out on that. Like I was saying before, the Acetabular cups have been in people for 10 years now. And a typical hip implant, a surgeon would tend to say to you, it should last at least 10 years. They really want the hip implant to last as long as possible, to avoid that need for a revision surgery. But 10 to 15 years is pretty standard. And after 10 to 15 years with a standard implant, that's when you would look to go into revision surgery. So that's where they cut you open again, and then they take the implant out, which, you know, is difficult and often it involves the removal of additional bone. You're obviously having that revision surgery because there's been some sort of, I guess, lack of, you know, adhesion or fixation of the implant to the bone in the first place. So in the process of coming loose, it's probably done a heck of a lot of jumping up against the pelvis and then degrading a lot of the bone around it. So further bone degradation. So they often need then to remove that degraded bone. And the revision surgery is always a much more complicated, time-intensive, infection-prone surgery. So, and often what we find is that 3D printing is not necessarily used for the first surgery, but it is for the second surgery, because that's when it becomes much more complex, much less standard, much less sort of off-the-shelf option suitable. So the question was, do they last longer than the normal one? Yeah, so like I said, we have 10 years worth of data so far. To my knowledge, no one has needed a revision, and I'm pretty sure I would have found out if they had. And that's pretty good going so far. So, but we're still in 10-year plus zone, and it would be really nice to fast forward 10 years into the future and see if we can get, you know, 3D printed implants to last 20 years, because if they did, then I think you could very definitively say a 3D printed implant lasts longer than a standard implant. And look, the important thing around that is actually around acceptance. So, you know, a lot of these medical technologies, I mean, for very, very understandable reasons, they are driven by data. And one of the challenges that 3D printing has had is that there's just not enough data there around to be able to make conclusive decisions around, is this actually better, right? So in all of the case studies I've just highlighted, there have been situations where a patient has no other option, and 3D printing is the last solution. But what we really need to work towards is getting mass aggregated data over a long period of time on 3D printed implants. And when it comes, I'll just add too, when it comes to personalized implants, that's even more challenging, because you then have to really reconsider and rethink the way in which you judge an implant, all of the ways in which, you know, our framework of evaluating implants are all based on standard implants. They're not based on personalization of implants. So there is a lot of challenges ahead. Anyway, we'll keep going with the questions.
No worries. I know you have only about 6 minutes left, or 7 minutes left. So there are two more questions. One of them was sent privately, so I don't mention a name, but what do you think about other materials for 3D printing? And what is your thoughts on PLA, polylactic acid, which is biodegradable over that of titanium?
It is. Yeah, so if we want to talk about what's approved for medical use, we have titanium, and we have another compound called PEEK. It's got a long name, polyethyl something or other. It's a polymer though, basically. And those two materials have been able to transition quite well because they are available conventionally for conventional manufacturing. They're approved already for medical use. So we have a number of different classes of use for medical devices, and this is the highest class of use, an implantable. So they're approved already for implantable use, and they're also 3D printable. So that's a really sort of easy sell. I think as far as materials for biomedical use though, or implantable use more specifically, we could be doing a lot better. So, you know, if we think about titanium alloy that we use for medical printing, you know, medical use even for our standard implants, it's an alloy. It's primarily titanium, but it also contains aluminium and vanadium. Now, do you really want aluminium and vanadium in your body? Not particularly, can I say. It's not hugely problematic, but you would prefer not to have it. Titanium is very biocompatible. Aluminium, vanadium, not so much. And there's some really good research happening at the moment around titanium tantalum. Titanium tantalum is biocompatible, but also tantalum is a much more friendly metal to be using in the body. And really the 3D printing question has sort of thrown up a whole lot of questions around materials and opened up the accessibility of different materials. So all the materials scientists are now very, very excited about 3D printing and the possibilities of using 3D printing, because all of your traditional constraints around materials that existed, you know, prior to additive manufacturing, now all of a sudden with additive manufacturing don't exist, or don't exist so much, or throw up a whole lot more possibilities around processing. So we certainly could do better on our alloys. You know, we use titanium alloy in lots of different applications, like, you know, aerospace and you know, marine. Do we really want aerospace plane bits floating around in our body, or should we have something that's much more suitable for medical use? PLA, I'm not a huge polymers person, but that's correct. It is compostable, basically. You can throw it in your compost bin, and it does degrade over time. I haven't personally tried that out, I have to say, but you wouldn't use it for an implantable device. It's not approved, and nor is it strong enough. So, you know, it's definitely for materials, it's a matter of choosing the best tool for the best job.
Awesome. Thank you, Alex. And that was a question from Jinish. So thanks for that question, Jinish. I wanted to ask you about soft tissues, but I will skip that because I know you have to go. There's a question from Al, I believe. With the spinal implant, how do they fit it around the spinal cord?
Oh, sorry, I just saw a comment from Billy. PLA only biodegrades under high temperature and no oxygen environments, which you can have, by the way, in your hot composting. So if you've got a really good hot compost, it will work, because that is a no oxygen, high temperature environment. Anyway, the spinal cord. Now that is quite a good question that I do not know the answer to. Because it was round, as I showed on the slide, and so yeah, how is it? I don't know. I'll have to go and find out. Good question. I mean, I'm assuming surgeons have a way of doing these things.
Must be someone just said post-mortem. Hopefully not. All right, I know you have to go. So is there any question? If you want to ask a question, feel free to unmute yourself. And
while I'm waiting, I might go and see if I can find my acetabular cup. So most 3D printing people always have like a box of goodies. This is mine, and if I was prepared a little bit better, I would have just had it all sitting here on my desk. But there you go, that's an acetabular cup. So this is what fits in, this part here fits into the pelvis. That's the stem there that you typically put a screw through. And then here is the cup part. So that's what the head of the femur fits into. There's usually, this is all metal obviously, but there's usually there is always a sleeve that sits against that that metal part of a sort of, I think it's a no, I can't remember the material, but it's a polymer based material that the bone sits up against. The bone doesn't sit up against the metal. But one thing that's really great there is, hopefully you can sort of see that that's a really complex structure that you see on the implant surface. And if you were to cross-section it and take a look, what you would see is a whole lot of little T's and sitting on the surface of this implant. And what happens is when the bone meets the top of the T, it grows across the T, and then it grows down, and then it grows around the T. And so in that way, it's able to grow on and then in and around these little micro, well, I wouldn't say microstructures, but these little tiny structures. And that's what really assists with the fixation of the implant, which is a structure, by the way, that you can't produce with traditional manufacturing. I've got also this one here. So you'll see here that, I'll just put that right up against the camera. So you see there, that's a lattice structure there. You can actually see through that. There you go. And here we have screw holes. This is actually a dog's jawbone. So it's, you know, similar to humans. It's this area here. And you can kind of make out that that's a dog's jaw, not a human jaw. There you go. I think this is actually another really interesting one. And this is really an area I don't know much about, which is heart surgery. But this here, so I'm sort of shaking this. You can see that that's just like a mesh, basically, that it's flexible. Now that whole entire structure is 3D printed. And this is a, you know, what sits in your aorta, whatever. If there's someone with a bit more medical experience and knowledge than me, feel free to speak up, but it's the, there's a word for it. It sits there and keeps it open. So there you go.
I just love the comments in the chat, like Jedi Jeremy saying that yes, he has boxes of obsolete 3D prints, although he says that less impressive. And Billy says, wow, proper printed
stent.
chainmail.
Yes, stent. Yeah, that's right. Printed chainmail. That's there. And yeah, that's right. I think that's right. It's a stent. That's the correct word for it. Yeah. And you know, we can also do sort of industrial parts as well. So this is a little you know, sort of compressor, you know, blisk type thing. What you can see is that the, oh, I don't know if it's really obvious, but basically the width of the blade goes from a thick to a thin section, so that it's very thin at the end, much thicker at the top. And ordinarily you can't, it's very hard to achieve this at this scale. And also that level of bend that you can see that it's, not only is it bending, but it's also sort of curving around. It's very challenging. You could do this with traditional manufacturing. It would just be very, very expensive. And one of the best things about being in this industry is that you get heaps of free bottle openers and they're all topologically optimized. I have a whole collection in my kitchen.
Maybe one day you can invite us. No, I'm not trying to say that, and we can
come for a beer anytime, Gabor. I'll invite May too.
Thank you very much, Alex. I know you have to go, but thanks so much for coming today. It was very insightful. I learned a lot. I think all of us did. So yeah, thank you so much. And if you unmute yourself and clap for Alex, that's great. That would be great.
Okay, that's all right. Thank you so much for having me. And yeah, I hope you learned something. And you know, if anything, just take away from this that Australia is actually kicking goals when it comes to manufacturing. Don't believe all the bad news. There's plenty of good news stories out there, and I hope you've all had a wonderful day.
Thank you, Alex.
Thanks.
Have a good one.
Thank you very much, everyone.
All right.
Thank you.
I might head off if that's okay.
No worries. Thank you, Alex, for coming.
See ya. Bye.
Bye-bye.